Welcome to Speakeasy JS, the meetup for mad science, hacking, and experiments. I'm Faraz, and I'll be your host this afternoon. Mad science is about building things that make people say, I didn't know that was possible. And so today, we're joined by Ilya Kreymer. Hey, Ilya, how's it going?
Hi, Faraz. Thank you for having me here.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, glad that you can make it. I'm super excited for your talk today.
So I basically just wanted to talk about kind of web archiving in general and sort of the kind of the mad science that's involved in making web archives work in the first place. And so I'll do a quick presentation and a demo, and then hopefully answer some questions about all these tools.
Nice. Yeah. So the project you've been working on is called Web Recorder, right?
Yes, that's the name. Yeah.
Yeah, I've had my eye on that for a while. Like I wanted to take a closer look at it, but I haven't had a chance to like dive into it. But I know just from like my limited experience trying to save like a website to work offline. Like I've tried to do that a few times, and it's kind of a bit of a nightmare, just because like you'd think that like it would be an easy thing to do in this day and age, but like there's just so many random like links that are pointing to different things that are hidden away inside of like JavaScript files and so on and so forth. So I know there's like a lot of difficulties. And from the people I know at the Internet Archive, they were telling they've talked a bit about how like it's it's not enough to just archive the site as is. There's all this extra work you have to do to kind of like rewrite the links and things to make it work. So that's my exposure to it. I know it's kind of it's not an easy task to do. So I'm curious I'm curious to hear about how you managed to do all that and keep the captures like pretty high fidelity.
Yeah. So that's exactly what I was going to talk about. Hopefully.
Nice. Well, I'm excited.
So I thought I'd start with kind of just a kind of So my talk is high fidelity web archiving in the browser, and I thought I'd just start with sort of what is web archiving for anyone who's new to this. And so this is kind of sort of the official definition from the International Internet Preservation Consortium, and they basically define it like this. So basically the idea is collecting portions of the web and in an archival format, and then making that data available for access and use. And I like to think sort of divide this into sort of these three stages: the capture stage, actually getting the web resources storage, and then replay, which is recreating the web pages that were stored. And so I'll talk about all of these phases and sort of kind of where web archiving started. I guess, of course, Internet Archive is a pioneer of the field. There's sort of a crawler that sort of kind of spiders the web, sort of parsing HTML and automatically following links and so forth, and just grabbing content. And then there's the Wayback Machine that loads the archive documents that were crawled. And so that kind of worked for, I think that a traditional approach works and has worked for the web for many number of years, but there's sort of kind of a big problem, or a small problem, but really a big problem, and that's JavaScript. And kind of the idea of a crawler that can basically just spider the web and grab everything and then reproduce that again is really kind of all kind of taken apart really by JavaScript and modern websites. And so the approach that the Web Recorder project has taken is essentially browser-based archiving. So instead of a crawler, you have the browser. The browser is both the system that captures, basically the system that both captures web pages and plays them back. And so in this approach, the archiving process is controlled by the browser itself. So essentially, what you see is what is being archived, and that's kind of also what we call high fidelity, which is essentially replaying the content as accurately as possible. So that's not ideally it appears the same way as it was when it was sort of on the live web. And so, well, how can you archive using the browser? First, there's a save page as. that has existed in browsers from the very beginning. Unfortunately, SafePage JS, as you mentioned, and probably others have seen, is mostly broken for modern websites because the approach is sort of different. It treats websites as documents, really, when that's not how they work mostly. Then there's also an HTTP proxy approach where you essentially have to connect the browser to a proxy and kind of get the traffic that way. And that is doable, but also requires users to configure a proxy or to use a browser that's already configured through a proxy. And then Web Recorder has also tried that approach as well. And kind of the latest approach is with the browser extension. There's actually a browser extension that you can use, and I'm going to talk about how it works. It's available on archiveweb.page, sort of kind of an easy to remember URL. And if you go there, you can install the browser extension, and I'll demo it in a bit. Yeah, so how do you do this? Well, there aren't really any APIs for archiving specifically, even though you might think that that's something that a browser should provide. And so what we do is we save all of the HTTP requests and response traffic, but that's what we need to do, essentially. And the only way to do that in Chrome is to use the Chrome debugger APIs, and so essentially connect to the browser as if you were debugging it. So it's sort of a hack, but that's essentially what we have. And Firefox doesn't have this API, so currently this extension is only for Chromium, unfortunately, because a different approach is necessary to make it work in Firefox. And then for the storage, the data is stored in the IndexedDB, which is a database that's available in the browser. And so how do you archive in the browser a little bit faster? And to do that, and the reason that it can be slow is that you really have to manually visit every page that you want to archive. And it can be tedious to click on every link and to interact with every element. And so we also are working on automated behaviors that can be injected into the browser to automate certain things like scrolling. And we even have custom domain-specific behaviors for social media sites. But of course, they can break at any time. Yeah, just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, I'll go ahead and, so I already have the extension installed. And so what I'll do is, so I'm on Twitter here, I'll just go to, maybe I'll go to the Web Recorder profile, and I'll go ahead and, so I'll create a new, I'll call it demo, and I'll click start. And so what that does, and you can see that here it says that Web Recorder archive web page is started debugging the browser, and that's of course because I'm using the debugger APIs. So it's sort of also there to remind me that I'm archiving. And here there's it's already telling me how much data has already been archived. So I've actually archived this many URLs, one page, and this much data was loaded, and this much data was stored, and that's because they're different because data is being deduplicated. And so what I can also do is start Autopilot, which is the automated system. So by clicking on that, I've actually activated a JavaScript behavior that will now automatically scroll and click on every tweet in the timeline. And so that's basically the idea, is that perhaps I want to archive this this timeline, and I don't want to do this manually. And so I've basically activated this behavior, and so it'll just kind of keep going, and it'll tell me how many tweets. So it's up to 5 tweets now, and of course this is all kind of it's trying to yeah, there's a lot that it could do. It could, for example, click on all the quoted tweets, I think in the interest of time, it's not doing that. And so yeah, if I just let it run, it'll just kind of keep going. It'll also click on any images. But I think, yeah, in the interest of time, I'll just go ahead and pause it. So I'll pause it here, and then I can, so let's say I want to archive another page. Let's say it's the Web Recorder homepage. So I can click on that, and now it will open, in this case, it opens in a new tab, and also actually is also archiving this tab as well. So what I could do here is I could kind of manually click on which pages I want to archive. At this point, let's say I want to archive the tools page. There isn't yet anything that does kind of more broader crawling, so it's sort of one page at a time, but I could make it, if I click autopilot here, it'll just auto scroll to the bottom of the page. And so yeah, so here it tells me in this tab it's archived this much. In this tab, it's archived that, and then I can also click on Browse Archive, and that will take me to this page, which lists the 3 pages that I've archived, and then they're stored in the browser. But before I can, and so now before showing what that looks like, I'll kind of, so that's basically the capture part, as well as the storage, which is in the browser. And so I think this is actually the hard part is, well, now that you've archived that, how do you actually play it back? So we've got all this data that's in the browser, now what? So we need a web server because all of that data was served from a web server. Luckily, we have service workers, which kind of provide an amazing interface in the browser that can essentially emulate a web server. And so the service workers essentially intercept requests and can serve responses to them. And we also need a way to map these requests to responses. So here's a little bit kind of the details of how it works, and that is that, for example, if we've archived example.com, it'll be served from sort of the extension replay prefix, and then it will load the response for example.com. And so then we also need to rewrite all of the HTML that might have a link to example.com to actually load from the extension replay prefix. So that's one thing that needs to be done, all of the rewriting of the URLs. Then, and this kind of gets progressively harder, all of the JavaScript in the page might access, for example, window.location, expecting the original URL of the page. And so if instead it loads a different URL, such as the URL of the extension, it'll likely break. And so what we have to do, and this is sort of a neat little hack, is that we actually wrap all of the standard JavaScript objects with proxy wrappers and essentially override everything such as window, location, top, all the document, sort of all the standard objects. And then finally, or I should say not quite finally yet, but there's a client-side library that's injected into the page, and that overrides sort of a whole bunch of different things, all of the fetch and AJAX requests, every single attribute accessor on the HTML DOM, CSS changes, post message, document.write, eval, and there's probably a few other things that I'm forgetting. And this is handled by the wombat.js library. And essentially the idea is that anything that deals with a URL needs to be intercepted so that anything that requests the original URL, rather anything that will make the JavaScript think that it's running on a domain other than the one that it's supposed to be running on, so is intercepted and rewritten so that it's serving the original URL. And so it's sort of rewriting URLs both ways, from the archived URL to the original one, and from the original to the archived one. And And so all of that happens just when I, so for example, if I click on this page here, and I can actually, I guess I can stop. So this is still archiving, so I'm going to go ahead and stop. And so all of that has happened in order for this page to load, which is an archive of twitter.com/webrecord.io loaded from this prefix. So it's actually loaded from the extension prefix, but all of the JavaScript on the page is sort of tricked into thinking that it's actually being loaded from twitter.com. And that's really sort of the key to making this work. And the more complex the JavaScript or the more things that it's doing, the more work is needed to essentially trick it into thinking that it's running off of a different domain. And so yeah, so I can kind of click on all the tweets that I've clicked on when recording should still be available. I should be able to. So I clicked on this link. And so this page is here, and then I clicked on tools, so this page is here. I didn't click on the other pages, so those would be 404s. Yeah, and so kind of continuing on, so the other part of this is even if you have all of the URL rewriting and kind of interception there's still this really hard problem of fuzzy matching, where you actually don't have exact request response mapping. So you might have a URL that was archived with a timestamp of 1234, but then when you play it back, it's actually a different timestamp, 1235, for example. And this is super common. Oops, I ignore this typo here, but and this happens all the time because depending on the network latency and other factors, you really often don't get the same URLs. And so as a result, the replay system needs to find a way to cope with this kind of fuzzy matching. And this is also why it's using IndexedDB in the browser, because IndexedDB allows prefix searches. So you could kind of, for example, I could search for everything that starts with example.com and then do a match for the best possible match based on the current request. And so one of the things that it does is essentially compare query parameters between archive responses and the incoming request, and kind of compute the Levenshtein distance and kind of find the best match that way, which is, again, sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. And so I've kind of, there's basically a heuristic there to try to find that closest match. For certain sites, there are certain domain-specific rules. So, for example, YouTube and kind of Twitter and other top 10 sites, it was worth it to create specific rules to make this matching more accurate. And then there's a whole process of post requests and the need to convert post requests to GET requests, because sometimes you have the same, essentially, URL that's exactly the same, and it only differs based on the post data. And so you have to actually compare the post payload from your current request to all of the ones that have been archived to find the closest match. And yeah, so I guess the point of this is sort of to say that, in a way, Web Archive Replay is kind of a big hack, in a way, because the web is really not built to be archived. And it's always a moving target as new technologies are introduced. So if there's some new web API that isn't being intercepted, that uses URLs in some way that allows kind of the page to essentially detect that it's running off of the wrong domain and something breaks. So in a way, it's sort of like, I think, at this point, web archiving is more and more like emulation rather than just sort of document retrieval, but in a way with kind of incomplete, inexact data. Because even if you have an archive of a certain site or what you think is a complete site in a certain way, it's still incomplete because obviously you don't have the server, and there's enough entropy that it's always incomplete. For example, for highly dynamic sites like social media, and yeah, and then also I want to talk briefly about exporting archives. So in addition to the extension being able to store the data in IndexedDB, it is able to export it into WARP or WAXI format. WARP is a standard format in web archiving that's used by Internet Archive and many libraries. And WAXI basically packages the WARP files into a zip file and kind of bundles them together and includes a built-in index. And the key thing with the WAXI format is that it allows on-demand loading, so you could download a very large archive and kind of, or essentially share a large archive and have it be loaded on demand, so that you don't need to download the entire thing. And once you have this WAXI file, you could host it on any web server and then load it through the Play web page. And so, yeah, so basically I can, if I were to go here, I could, so I have this demo, and I can download this as either a WARP file or as a WAXI file, and then I can basically put that on any web server and then load it through the Replay web page. So actually, I guess I could also just load it locally here. So the other part about this is that in order to create the archive, you need the extension. It needs to be in Chrome or Chromium-based browser. In this case, obviously, I'm using Brave. In order to load it, I can actually, this should work in any browser, in any modern browser, I should say. So it does work in Firefox and Safari as well. And then I can, sort of, this is the archive I just created. I can also, one of the things that in this, there's also experimental sharing with IPFS, which does work pretty well with Brave because through its native IPFS support. So that's another way that archives can be shared. And yeah, and so basically now I can actually, I can also load it through the web page using the IPFS sharing. Although this works much better in Brave than it does in for example, Chrome because of Brave's native IPFS node. And yeah, and so I guess kind of to wrap it up, other ongoing work, kind of improving the sharing features, adding, making it easier for people to share archives. And in fact, I think that's, I initially talked to Faros about using Wormhole for this potentially, and making it easier for people to share these WAXI files that are created. Also, automated backup to external storage so that it's not just in your browser. If you want to, for example, store it on S3 or some other storage that you have, there should be a way to do that more automatically. And then, of course, maintaining all of the replay fidelity and kind of keeping up with changes as it's essentially constant, continuous maintenance is required to make this work. I guess I should end it on that because it's also kind of a big hack, but it does work. Yeah, and I think I can maybe take some questions now.
Nice. Thanks for showing us that. Super cool. It was a great overview of the whole project. So yeah, if you have questions, for Ilya, you can post them in the chat now, and I'll ask him. But yeah, my questions are, I guess, how many sort of sites have you archived? Is the archiving and hosting of the recordings part of what you're interested in, or are you collaborating with anyone else to actually host the recordings?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so the idea with this is to kind of not necessarily have another centralized archive, but to have tools for people to create archives on their own. And so previously, up until last year, Web Recorder was part of Rhizome.org, which was a nonprofit based in New York. And at that stage, we collaborated on a hosted service that Rhizome is still operating. Now it's called Conifer. And so that they're hosting that service for people to store their own archives. Although what I'm trying to do now is really make it possible for people to create archives of their own. And we are working with a variety of different institutions that are kind of using the tools in various ways to essentially put archives into their existing workflows, or just host them online as part of the repositories. And yeah, I mean that's sort of the idea, is to kind of make it possible for people and institutions to create archives and host them on the web. For example, as easily as you might host a video, for example. And maybe I should actually, yeah, I could very quickly show. So this is kind of a so I wanted to show kind of an example of what you might do with an archive once you have it created. And just find this link here. And I've been experimenting with, for example, uploading archives to Glitch. And so here's something that you could do, is essentially take a Waxy file that was created in archive web page and hosted and embedded like this, like you would embed a video, and then you can kind of interact with the page. So here's an archive of a tweet. Here's a different archive of a YouTube video that kind of shows up in a frame like this. And again, this is hosted on Glitch, and it'll, the idea is that this works exactly like you would expect it to work as in terms of being a YouTube video. And so, yeah, I think various individuals and institutions are kind of using these tools to host web archives.
That's really cool. I could see that taking off as like if there was like in the same way that like a lot of consumers will normal people will go and like archive a site or a URL. I see that a lot these days. They'll post like, I forget what the different there's a few different sites people use to like snapshot a page, but those are like, I think, pretty static. I could see this this being like a better version of one of those. Those embeds are really cool. The fact that you could embed like a fully interactive copy of YouTube that can't go away, that's really neat. I like that a lot. What's the coolest use case you've seen so far? Like, has anyone done anything that surprised you with Web Recorder?
Oh, that's a good question. Trying to think. I think that there have been probably so many, but now I'm trying to think of one. I guess early on, this was a few years ago. I remember Web Recorder tools were used to create archives for education in a prison system to work with inmates. So, for example, they would archive educational materials and use them to work with inmates in a prison. I believe it was around here in the Bay Area. and of course they need to do that because there's no internet, and so it's kind of a way of getting around that, where you could create an archive and bring it into an offline environment. I think that's definitely made me think about kind of the, for example, ways that archives could be used to, for example, in situations where there's low internet connectivity, no internet, or internet censorship, and sort of all these kind of use cases that go kind of beyond sort of just the link rep scenario where you're actually kind of dealing with other situations where live websites may not be available for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, we got a question here from the chat. Tiny Fluff asks, is anyone working on reverse polyfills to implement old APIs that got pulled? My old web games don't have audio anymore because the web audio API changed, but it feels intimidatingly complex to fix.
Not that I know of. I mean, in theory, that should be possible. But yeah, I mean, I think it's just a challenge keeping up with existing APIs. That unfortunately, I mean, yeah, Web Recorder is a fairly small project right now. It's myself and a part-time developer and a part-time community manager. So we really, unfortunately, don't have the resources to do that, but I'm happy to help if anyone is interested in that. I mean, and I think it's just, yeah, I mean, there's kind of, I mean, in a way that the system kind of, like, for example, I remember doing a lot of work with a few years ago when YouTube was Flash-based and archiving YouTube Flash videos and having them work. And I think those APIs might still be supported somewhere, not in this iteration of the extension, but in previous tools. But yeah, I mean, it's in theory it's doable, but I think finding the time and the resources to work on that is tricky.
I'll just take this opportunity to shout out something I worked on that was kind of along these lines. I wanted to make old Midi files playable in the browser, so I took a library called libtimidity, which can play Midis, and it was written in C, and compiled it to WebAssembly. And then I made I guess you could call it a reverse polyfill for the BG sound tag, which used to let you like play audio in the background on a website. And so I'll put the URL up here on the screen, but if you just add this one line script to the page, then it like magically makes BG sound tags work. And one of my friends who was doing what do you call it? Did an archive of GeoCities. Kyle Drake, who works on NeoCities now, but yeah, he made like a GeoCities archive and then used the library. Actually, we were at a conference. We were at the DWeb camp together, and he kind of nerd sniped me into making him a reverse polyfill for BG Sound, so that he could use it in his archive.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, maybe that's I could definitely look into supporting that in the extension and replay web page as well. Yeah.
I mean, it's probably not likely that people are capturing pages today that contain the BG Sound tag, since it hasn't been supported since it was never standardized, and it was just been gone for a long time. But so it's probably not worth your time. But I just wanted to mention it as a. I mean, it is. Yeah. I almost feel like browsers should probably should produce these like reverse polyfills whenever they're deprecating an API and provide it as like a service to the sites that are affected. Yeah,
and of course Flash is a big one right now.
Yeah.
And currently, the extension does actually integrate the Ruffle emulator, so that sort of automatically, when you are browsing a site that has Flash, I think Ruffle should step in and start loading if it can. Of course, Ruffle is not perfect, and but it does work great for many older Flash projects. So.
So I noticed in the demo you showed a couple of minutes ago, you showed YouTube in an embed working, and I wonder so I noticed there's an ad that started to play like was that seems to me like the JS would be pretty dynamic. Like reaching out to an ad server and saying, hey, give me like an ad for this user. And I'm guessing that you did one of those custom integrations for YouTube to solve that. Is that right, or did you do? Is there something else going on?
Not anything for ads. Yeah, actually, I mean, ads are definitely. I mean, I haven't spent a whole lot of time on ads.
I mean, I'm not saying you should archive the ads. I just mean like I mean, although maybe arguably, I mean, there are archives of old ads on the Internet Archive that are actually pretty fascinating to go back and see what the ads were like back then. But I just mean like to make it not break when it goes to make that request.
I think it just I'm not entirely sure what. I think for YouTube, actually, the main thing that I do for YouTube is, and I didn't mention in the slides, but so YouTube by default breaks up the video into small chunks using I think Dash or JS for essentially adaptive streaming based on your bandwidth, which makes it really hard to archive that. But there is a way to kind of force it to just sort of a nice MP4, and so it is using that approach to just then grab an entire MP4 of a YouTube video. And be able to play it back on the page. Of course, there's tools like YouTube DL, which are great for kind of just downloading the video offline. But to make it then play inside of a page is harder. And so I think for that reason, web recording tools attempt to kind of capture and read the network traffic as accurately as possible so that it can be played in the page. And so occasionally that perhaps, I'm guessing for the ad, it might be that the fuzzy matching is somehow kicking in, and it's matching an ad that was, like if there's only one ad that was loaded and there's a request for an ad, maybe it just works. And so that is that it's, in a way, I'm always kind of surprised when things do work, because of how much, in a way, hacking is involved in making web archive replay work in the first place for modern websites. So it's always kind of, and so that's, sometimes it just works, I guess, and sometimes then I have to spend figuring out why not.
That's cool. Yeah, there's like heuristics involved, so like when it works, you're just like, whoa, it actually worked. Yeah, that's really cool. So I have some other kind of self-interested questions. I'm curious, like when you put the browser into debug mode, like this is for the recording phase. You mentioned that you use the debug sort of interface that the browser provides. Is that visible in any way to the website? Like if they wanted to like try to block you or something, is it actually a way to script your browser that's undetectable from their perspective, or does it leak somehow that you're doing it?
I'm not sure. That is a good question. I mean, I think it's, so the user obviously sees that sort of bar at the top that says,
oh yeah.
As far as the site, I'm guessing not, because it's sort of the same as opening DevTools in a way. So it's kind of, I think that it's basically, so it's using the same protocol that DevTools is using when the DevTools window is open. So, but maybe, I mean, I think I am, for example, I'm disabling caching just to make it easier to archive things. Maybe there are other ways to detect it, but I'm not entirely sure. Yeah.
That's okay. I just was wondering if you ran into anybody like trying to do this to prevent, because I know like certain sites like Zillow isn't notorious, at least for me. Whenever I like click on like 5 of those links to open up like, house listings, it'll just be like, are you a robot, right after 5 clicks. So I can imagine, like, I don't know, just if you're running it, it'll run into CAPTCHAs and stuff like that, which
it could, yeah. I mean, for example, if you're running it through, and that's why it's sort of, I think, kind of the most accurate archiving that you can do is directly through the browser. Like if you have for example, a proxy or something like that, then it sort of makes it easier to detect, and then it's sort of different than kind of what you actually see in your browser. And so that's kind of also, in a way, it's sort of more accurate, but also you also, in a way, have to be careful, because you also are able to archive everything that's kind of all this personalized data. Like it can archive cookies, for example, which are necessary for playing back certain sites. I mean, and so it's kind of a tricky balance as well. Like if you want to, I mean, ideally, I would have to archive cookies, but then if I don't, then, for example, certain sites just won't load at all. And determining that is also kind of a tricky area.
How do you deal with that as far as privacy? Because I mean, I noticed, well, actually, there's a couple angles I'm curious about. Because one is like you just mentioned, you might archive cookies, and like that could be like someone's session ID or something in there, which could let a random person who's viewing this archive like actually log in as you, especially if the cookie is long lived. But then the other angle is like you had that auto mode, which was automatically going through and like scrolling your timeline and archiving things. And I would be a little worried personally about it potentially going into my messages and archiving like my DMs with people, or like, you know, I don't know, like maybe accidentally capturing, like maybe there's some preloaded data that includes my DMs somewhere in the page, even if it's not visible in the UI. And so maybe somehow my like private info is getting archived somehow.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a risk. I don't know that there's any good answer to that, and I mean, other than just being careful in terms of what you share publicly. So obviously, it's by default it's all just in your browser. If you download the file and share it with others, or use the IPFS sharing, then it becomes public. Maybe there is a way to analyze that data before, like maybe this is something I've thought about, is maybe there's a way to download but strip out all the cookies, for example, for things like might accidentally be on the page. I think that's that is more difficult, but definitely something I thought about. Like, for example, especially for archiving social media, if maybe there's a way to export data but be able to anonymize the names or the usernames, which I think could be especially useful for cases where they're trying to archive something that might be sensitive. And so, yeah, I mean, I agree that I think it's just, yeah, in a way, this is sort of very different than kind of like the type of archiving that, for example, Internet Archive can do, where it's basically everything that's public. This allows you to kind of archive things on the other end, and just everything that's private, and exactly what's loaded in your browser, which kind of all of the caveats that come with that.
Right. Yeah, I have another question about the like rewriting phase. You mentioned, you know, once you have these captures, then you need to kind of rewrite the URLs and try to like basically trick the JavaScript to think that it's running in the same, like on the same origin as it was originally intended to run on. And you're using proxy to wrap the standard JavaScript objects like window. And first of all, that's super cool that, like, I think it's super cool that JavaScript is flexible enough to allow you to do that in a way that might actually have a chance at convincing a site that it's running in a completely different context. And I'm actually kind of surprised you're able to proxy like window.location, because that seems so fundamental.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, and actually, I think credit goes to a former colleague, John Berlin, who first worked with us when a web recorder was at Ryzen, who I think initially suggested that idea. And the reason that works is because it's basically creating another scope. So it's no longer, you can't do that in the global scope, but you could, essentially, if you do let window and then put everything else in a scope, then it allows you to override that. Which
so you're shadowing it.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, right. Yeah, shadowing is the word. Yeah. So you're basically, which is also kind of surprising that this is allowed in a way. And so like a lot of it is, so like if that wasn't allowed, that would probably limit the extent of how the rewriting could work. And a previous attempt was just to kind of detect and kind of match things by regex, which is less efficient. Probably eventually a more robust solution would probably be to actually have a whole JavaScript parser in the browser that parses and does the rewriting that way. And I think now that's probably fairly feasible. When I started on this initially about 7 years ago, I think that was probably a lot more difficult. So maybe this should be revisited with that approach.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, certainly, I mean, if you're willing to like, if you go to far enough lengths, you'll be able to like trick the JavaScript no matter what. I mean, like I can imagine though, like at least right now with the current approach you mentioned of like shadowing the window variable, that a site, like a really determined site, could figure out how to detect this. I mean, if it wanted to, it could just like, eval, I think, might let you run code in the global scope. I'm not sure. I know there's ways to like sort of get like the true global object.
They're probably, yeah. I think if a site really wanted to detect, there are ways that, like the rewriting system is not. Right.
It's not trying to trick it so thoroughly. If it was like really determined, it's just trying to make like most code that most developers are writing work.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't go to very far to try to hide itself as much as just kind of intercepting what's the common behavior. Yeah.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah, in a way, it's also, and actually, I should also mention that the rewriting system itself on the client, the wombat.js, is also used by Internet Archive now. So like even though it's not using their system is not using a service worker, it's using a different replay engine on the server. The client side is actually also using this approach because it's sort of probably the only way to make some of these highly complex sites work is to do all this rewriting on the client. And so, yeah, so I mean, yeah, it seems to be the only approach so far.
That's really cool. I mean, I'm glad that JavaScript is flexible enough to let that work, and that because I mean, I don't know. There's always these proposals that come up where people want to lock down the language in some way to make it more like I don't know, more secure, which is can be good sometimes, but there's always the flip side, which is like if you want to make a crazy mad science idea work in JavaScript, you often can because things are so open. And so like one of the things that one of the proposals that I was a little bit I guess it's fine, but it's sort of going down this path of like locking the language down is private fields, where you can sort of have a class with fields which are actually private to the outside world and not just sort of obfuscated through underscore prefixing the name of the function or the name of the variable. And that means that I guess it wouldn't affect probably what you're doing here, but there's oftentimes when you actually do want to go in and monkey patch something or do something that's probably a bad idea, but you still sometimes need to do bad ideas because that's the only way to get something done. And and it seems like we're by closing that off, we're kind of going into a direction that's I don't know, maybe I don't know if that were to become more common. Do you think it would affect the the approach that you're using right now?
Possibly, yeah. I mean, it's hard to say sort of which features kind of. Yeah, I think mostly. I think it's mostly kind of the web APIs themselves that kind of have so many different. I mean, there's so many different ways that you could, for example, get the origin of the page, or sort of the rewritten URL, and so yeah, I think as soon as a new API is introduced, that's sort of yet another thing that could kind of break in a way. I mean, I think I think I don't know if private fields specifically would affect, but yeah, I mean, who knows if for example, proxy objects couldn't work as they do now, that could affect things. But I'm hoping that there will be some backwards compatibility as things evolve. But then again, I mean, all of it is kind of built on using things not how they were intended in a way. I mean, the service workers are designed for offline caching, not for purchasing. And so again, it was in a way sort of working in this area is sort of kind of used to, in a way, working with things not in the way that they were designed to. Or like eval, there's a whole bunch of hacks that are needed to kind of override eval, which of course you're not even supposed to use anymore, but that doesn't help if you're trying to replay pages that use eval all over the place. So that, yeah, I think eval is definitely kind of especially tricky, and probably won't ever work perfectly unless you have a JavaScript parser that can parse eval and then rewrite things in the proper scope. So, yeah.
So where can people go if they want to get involved with Web Recorder? I assume you're open to people helping out if they're interested.
Absolutely, yes. And I think we probably do a better job of kind of directing people where to. I mean, I think all of these tools could probably use additional help. They're all on GitHub and various repositories. We also have a forum. I guess it could, yeah, maybe that's kind of a good place to start. Just forum.webrecorder.net. And yeah, we could share that link, and folks can go there to ask questions. And the actual, yeah, the extension is on GitHub, but webrecorder/archiveweb.page. But then it itself is kind of split into, yeah, there's basically a few different libraries. So probably the forum would be a good place to start if you have questions, or also email info@webrecorder.net.
Nice. Cool. Yeah, I put all that info up on the screen for people who want to check it out. Cool. So yeah, thank you so much for coming here and presenting to us. Yeah, it's a really interesting project, and you know, I can't believe you've been working on it for 7 years. It's a really long time to be working on a project. I've been doing WebTorrent for I guess a similar amount of time, and but kind of on and off in terms of you know, doing it full time. So I think it's really admirable, and good job.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks again for having me. I'm really happy to present here and talk to you.